So there's this thing in Ocarina of Time called the autojump. When Link is just about to run off the edge of a platform, instead of falling, he'll automatically jump, hence the autojump. So my original plan for this video was to tell a fun little story about how that autojump was created. But just as I was about to be finished, I discovered a fact which turned everything on its head. And now I'm not even sure who created the autojump at all. So first, I'm going to tell you that original story I stumbled upon, and then afterwards I'll explain why things are actually a lot more messy and controversial than I first realised. At the centre of Link's automatic jump is this guy here, Eiji Aonuma. Nowadays, I think a lot of us see him as the Zelda guy. He's been with the series for over a decade, and he's produced every one of these games from the last 15 years. Wow. But when Aonuma joined Nintendo, he'd actually never played a single video game before in his life. Shocking, right? And so his first few months at Nintendo were mainly spent playing games just to get the hang of this new, or new to him, art form. Around the time he joined Nintendo, a game called The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past was released, and it really captured Aonuma's attention. It opened his eyes to the medium of games. Just look at this huge world to explore. And 2 years later, this game got a sequel called Link's Awakening. When Aonuma picked it up, he was quite literally captivated. He spent hours traversing the island of Koholint. It felt like a small world, but very vast as well, he'd later explain. To Aonuma, Link's Awakening really was the embodiment of what Zelda should be. This was the quintessential Zelda game. A few years later, Aonuma would be given an opportunity. All this time, he'd been desperately wanting to work on the Zelda series. And when he mentioned this to the game's creator, Shigeru Miyamoto, Aonuma was welcomed in with open arms. "We don't have enough people for The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, so come on in for a spell," he was told. That spell, by the way, ended up being the entire duration of the game's development. So Aonuma was put in charge primarily of the game's dungeons. It was his job to decide how these dungeons would look, what their layout would be, and which enemies would reside inside them. But Aonuma felt a little lost. He'd never made a Zelda game before, after all, so he struggled to figure out what the essence of a Zelda dungeon should be. Not only that, but this was the first time that Zelda had gone 3D. This was truly uncharted territory, and Aonuma was at the helm of the dungeon boat. What was he to do? When I started working on Ocarina of Time, this was the first time a lot of us were handling a 3D game. And so, it was a challenge. We didn't know what was right. We didn't know what the correct answer was. But I always had the vision of the dungeons and the gameplay from Link's Awakening. I never told anybody specifically, but I always had that in the back of my mind, and tried to convert the feeling I got from Link's Awakening into a 3D world. So, in other words, Aonuma directly used Link's Awakening to guide him and his team in designing not only the game's dungeons, but Ocarina of Time as a whole. And there was one very specific thing he took from Link's Awakening, a single item called the Roc's Feather. If you've never played Link's Awakening, Roc's Feather is something you pick up fairly early on, which allows you to jump. You can jump over gaps or even jump over enemies. And so Aonuma explained in an interview with Edge magazine that Ocarina of Time's jump was directly inspired by the Roc's Feather from Link's Awakening. But that still leaves a big question for us to answer. In Link's Awakening, you press a button to jump. In Ocarina of Time, Link does it by himself. What's going on there? Well, it all comes back to Aonuma. In an interview with The Guardian, Aonuma explained that he was no good at what he calls jump games, like Mario, for instance. Remember, he'd never played a single video game before he joined Nintendo, so he didn't have any practice playing platformers when he was a kid. He further stated, quote, "I always miss the point where I should land, and I always cry out and say, wait a minute, is this the end of the whole story? Is there no rescue from that?" So, by Ocarina of Time's development, Aonuma was sick and tired of jump games. He didn't want to have to jump anymore. If only the game would do it for him. Which gave him an idea. What if the game could do it for him? He told this to the team, and a few months later, Link's autojump was up and running. And it was all because he wasn't any good at games. What a silly man. Okay, so that was going to be the end of the video. We found out who created the autojump. End of story. Except, not really. Because just as I was finishing up, I stumbled upon an interview. It was about the autojump, just like the other ones, except this time it wasn't with Aonuma. It was with Shigeru Miyamoto, the guy that created Zelda, and Aonuma's boss at the time of Ocarina of Time's development. And what he said completely contradicts everything we've learnt so far. Let me read you out part of that interview. So, Miyamoto and the interviewer, Iwata, are talking about how Ocarina of Time was one of the first games where standing on the top of a cliff and jumping off really made you feel dizzy, like it was a huge height in the real world. Miyamoto says, "That effect was born once we incorporated autojump. I thought of autojump on one of my days off. I couldn't wait to get to work on Monday. I gathered everyone on Monday morning and said, we're gonna do something called autojump. Everyone's response was, say what? The team that had made Mario games was going to give up the jump button. I thought, if we use autojump, then we can do all kinds of things." Yeah, Shigeru Miyamoto's story completely contradicts what Eiji Aonuma told us. Both of these stories can't be true. One person is making a mistake here. Either Eiji Aonuma created the auto-jump because he wasn't very good at platformers, or Shigeru Miyamoto came up with the idea one weekend. So, which story is true? I honestly don't know. I don't have a perfect answer that will tie up all the loose ends from this story. One of these men seems to be making a mistake, but I don't know which one. Maybe both of them had a similar idea to the auto jump and they were combined together into one final idea. But then, why didn't they mention that? I really don't know. I just wanted to share this story because I find it really fascinating how two people can tell a story of how they created one idea. Either way, whoever created the auto jump, it is certainly a successful idea, being used in every 3D Zelda game from Ocarina of Time all the way up until Skyward Sword. And whether this was a miracle idea thought of one weekend or a solution to someone's slightly lacking platformer skills, the auto jump is a huge part of what makes Ocarina of Time feel like Ocarina of Time, and I wouldn't change it for the world. Hey, thanks for watching. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you might actually remember me telling this story in the past. A few years ago I made a video covering this topic, but I wasn't really happy with how it turned out, so I decided all this time later to give it another shot. I hope you found this story interesting. I'll see you next week, and bye-bye!